so much, Senator Hatch. After an introduction like that, I'm not sure I can live with myself. And thank you, Senator, also for your work on religious freedom, for your leadership. Long before many people realized the challenges that were coming our way, you were on the job, and all of us are most grateful and heartened by your leadership. Thank you. Elder Von Keach, thank you for your kind words and for our friendship and collaboration. Elder Wilford Anderson, Dean Raspin, Mr. Marcus Faust, honored guests, a pleasure to be with everybody tonight. And I'm very grateful to the J. Reuben Clark Law Society and the International Center for Law and Religious Studies at Brigham Young University for honoring me and for spotlighting this cause of religious freedom. At a time when God and the things of God are being marginalized, compromised, how fortunate we are to have the J. Reuben Clark Society, whose mission is to affirm the strength brought to the law by a lawyer's personal religious convictions. Similarly, BYU's International Center for Law and Religious Studies effectively counters secular trends and government actions that seek to erode our first and our most cherished freedom. And so many other collaborators and co-workers are here tonight. And so I'm honored to be among friends and among co-workers this evening. Years ago, when I was serving as Cardinal James Cardinal Hickey's pre-secretary here in Washington, an old friend of mine came to visit me. I had not seen him in years. He was curious about my service to the Cardinal, and he wanted to see where I work. Well, I tried to give him some idea about what a pre-secretary does, arranging and managing the Cardinal's schedule, assisting with ceremonies, preparing for events, and helping with the flow of correspondence. In the course of my visit, I introduced my friend to the Cardinal, who greeted him warmly and asked all about his family. And as we were walking around the office building, the Chancery, my friend stopped and looked at me, and he said, "You know, you don't know how good you have it." To tell you the truth, I was surprised. It's not that I thought I was in a bad situation, but it took someone with fresh eyes to make me aware of the blessings God had given me. In essence, he said to me, "Don't take your blessings for granted." I thought of my friend when Pope Francis visited our country just a few weeks ago. Until then, the Pope had never been in this country. I think it was obvious to everyone that he prepared very carefully for his visit, studying our language and our culture, as well as the challenges which the Catholic Church and other churches are facing. But he didn't merely read speeches prepared by advisors. He looked at us with fresh eyes. He engaged us and reminded us of the many blessings God has given this country. In essence, he told us not to take our blessings for granted, but rather to cherish them and to use them in the service of others, especially the poor and the vulnerable. One blessing that Pope Francis spoke about very frequently was religious freedom. In his address on the South Lawn of the White House, Pope Francis spoke of the commitment of faithful people to build a society that is truly tolerant and inclusive, a society that rejects every form of unjust discrimination. Here we saw the Pope taking a second look at the religious faith of the people of the United States. He was pointing out to President Obama and to the nation that Catholics and that religious people in general are not motivated by narrow self-interest, but rather by a deep-seated desire to build a society upon respect for others, including those with whom we sincerely differ. And in seeking justice and tolerance, the Pope said, people of faith are concerned that society respect their deepest concerns and their right to religious liberty. The Pope added, as the Senator already said, religious liberty remains one of America's most precious possessions. I, for one, don't mind telling you that I was delighted that Pope Francis, from the balcony of the White House, no less, expressed his support for the efforts of the U.S. bishops to defend and to protect religious liberty. He encouraged us, all of us, to be good citizens who are vigilant, who are ready to preserve and defend that freedom from everything that would threaten or compromise it. In his remarks at the White House, the Pope did not mention any specific issue, such as the Health and Human Services mandate that would involve many church-sponsored ministries in the provision of sterilizations and contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs for their employees and their families. Later that day, however, the Pope visited the Little Sisters of the Poor here in Washington, the sisters who are so prominent in their courageous resistance to that unjust mandate. This gesture of support for the sisters prompts all of us here tonight to applaud their service to the elderly poor and their courageous defense of our most fundamental liberty. Thank you, Mother Lorraine. Thank you. Sisters, when I'm an old fellow, which I'm getting to be rapidly, don't forget to reserve me a room. You know, Pope Francis returned to the importance of religious freedom in his address to the Congress. Again, he helped us to see ourselves anew, first by pointing to the image of Moses in the chamber of the House of Representatives. It was through Moses that we received the Ten Commandments, which is a privileged expression of the law of God written on the human heart. Just legislation that reflects God's law unifies peoples, unifies nations, because it respects our God-given transcendent dignity. Unjust legislation that contradicts the law of God inscribed in our human nature ultimately leads to disunity and to the trampling of human rights and liberties. Today we see this with stark clarity in parts of the Middle East where full-blown persecution, even genocide, is underway, an unfolding tragedy that Pope Francis has spoken out about time and again. The Holy Father focused our attention when he spoke to the Congress on iconic figures in our culture, among them President Abraham Lincoln and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He called Lincoln the guardian of liberty, who labored tirelessly that this nation under God might have a new birth of freedom. Pope Francis reminded us that this new birth of freedom requires that we serve the common good with bedrock convictions about our shared human dignity, a dignity that is the basis for all human solidarity. He called for respect of those decisions that rightly belong not to the highest levels of government, but to individuals, in families, and churches, in institutions at the local level that serve the common good. These convictions about human dignity lead us to engage in the struggle to preserve our fundamental, universal, God-given freedoms, while resisting efforts to use religion for unjust and violent purposes. Indeed, the Pope urged us to use our freedom to build bridges of understanding and cooperation wherever possible. And in that spirit, the Pope referred to Martin Luther King Jr. and his leadership in attaining full civil and political rights for African Americans. This should inspire us, he told us, to live up to the highest ideals of our nation. It should inspire us as well to welcome immigrants who are seeking the blessings of liberty for themselves and for their families. A few days later, the Holy Father spoke at Independence Hall, Philadelphia, which he called the birthplace of the United States. Again, the Holy Father held up for us anew the ideals upon which our country is founded, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and the government exists to protect and defend those rights. Lofty ideals, of course, are one thing, but the struggle to live up to those ideals, quite another. Here too, the Holy Father helped us see with renewed clarity the political and social struggles that mark our nation's history. Overcoming threats and obstacles to the fulfillment of the founding vision of our country hinges on the preservation of religious freedom. Religious freedom understood not only as the right of individuals to worship as they please, but also as the right and duty of believers to be active in the public square, including in political life, reminding everybody freely that we're made for God and that our dignity transcends this world. Further, religious traditions, the Pope reminded us, have the right to serve society primarily by the message they proclaim. And as if to warn us not to take our freedoms for granted, the Pope pointed out the dangers of an overarching secularism that tries to eliminate all differences and traditions in a superficial quest for unity. Here, I think, Pope Francis is putting his finger on the nature of the religious struggles, the religious liberty struggles that we are undergoing in our country in these years. There are efforts, sometimes carried forward by the government itself, to force individuals to cease running their closely held businesses according to their deeply held religious convictions. There are efforts to force religious institutions serving the common good to compromise their deeply held religious convictions and moral teachings. And when people seek to put their religious convictions into practice, especially when they pertain to the nature of marriage and the family, then they are often labeled as bigots and as devotees of discrimination. Indeed, religious liberty is not real if we are unfree to proclaim and live by views that are culturally unpopular. Or if it is said that we are free to advocate for such views, but we are fined, taxed, jailed, or otherwise marginalized when we try to act upon our convictions. You know, when the Pope concludes his visits, his messaging is not over. We've all learned to tune in to his homeward-bound, airborne news conference. And so at 30,000 feet, he spoke about conscientious objection in our culture, spoke about the rights of conscience. He affirmed that conscientious objection is a human right that one does not lose just because one is a government worker. Whatever else one might say, it is clear that Pope Francis knows his own mind on this subject, the subject of the rights to conscientious objection. It's a right that protects not popular points of view, which often do not need to be protected, but to protect those convictions that are unpopular and countercultural. All of which brings me back to the observation of my friend of long ago, who helped me see how God is blessing my life. This Pope, who bears in his heart the plight of refugees and persecuted Christians, especially in the Middle East, helped us to see how we are blessed in the freedoms we enjoy. But he spoke of our need to dialogue courageously with our culture so as to preserve our freedoms so that we may use them in building a culture that is just and loving. Let me once again thank most sincerely the J. Reuben Clark Society, the International Center for Law and Religious Studies, and especially the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Let me thank you for your historic and dauntless defense of religious freedom, for your thoughtful and your courageous dialogue with law and culture, and for the partnership and warm friendship that I am privileged to enjoy, particularly in my role as the Bishop's point person on religious liberty issues. We all do well to remember the words of Joseph Smith when he said, "I am bold to declare before heaven that I am just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination, for the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics, or of any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves." This evening you do me great honor. I'm humbled and joyful. With all my heart I thank you, and join with you in asking God to bless these United States of America. Thanks for listening.